the ocean breathed. From the deck of the research vessel Eager, Dr. Elena Vasquez watched the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of the North Atlantic swells, a vast, living entity exhaling mist into the dawn air. The horizon was a razor-thin line separating two shades of infinite blue, and the only sound was the gentle shush of water parting before the ship's hull. In these quiet moments, before the day's work began in earnest, Elena felt the profound truth of her life study. This was not merely water. It was the planet's circulatory system, a colossal engine of life that regulated climate, cradled ecosystems, and sustained every breath drawn on land. She leaned against the cool railing, her fingers tracing the beads of salt spray. Below the mirrored surface, an entire universe thrived. A school of silver-sided fish flickered like a scattered coin purse, pursued by the darker, graceful shadow of a tuna. Further out, the misty plume of a humpback's blow punctuated the silence, a testament to the ocean's abundant, pulsing heart. She thought of the unseen currents, the great conveyor belts of cold and warm water that circled the globe, distributing heat and nutrients, making a world like theirs possible. It was a system of such elegant complexity, yet so easily taken for granted by those who never left the shore. Her morning ritual complete, Elena moved to her station in the lab, a compact space humming with the low thrum of servers and the glow of monitors. Her hands, practiced and sure, began the routine download from the array of sensors trailing behind the Eager. The data streams flowed, painting a familiar picture of salinity, temperature, and flow rates. For an hour, it was all as expected, a symphony of numbers singing the ocean's steady song. Then, a dissonant note. A cluster of sensors reported a brief, inexplicable temperature drop of half a degree, followed by a spike in salinity that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Elena's brow furrowed. She recalibrated. The instruments ran diagnostics and chalked it up to a deepwater eddy or a temporary sensor glitch. The ocean was full of such minor anomalies, quirks in an otherwise predictable pattern. She made a note in her log, a small, nagging detail filed away for later review. On deck, the crew went about their duties with the easy camaraderie of people who knew their roles. The scent of coffee and fried eggs wafted from the galley. Someone laughed, the sound crisp and clear in the salt-tinged air. A junior researcher meticulously cleaned plankton nets, his movements rhythmic and untroubled. The sun climbed higher, scattering diamonds across the water's surface. It was a picture of serene, scientific endeavor, a tiny bubble of human order adrift on the greatest wilderness on Earth. They were all custodians of this knowledge, observers on the periphery of a mighty force they believed was constant, eternal. They charted its moods and measured its pulse, never suspecting that the heart they were monitoring was, at that very moment, beginning to falter. The calm was a beautiful, terrible lie. The lie shattered in a cascade of screaming alarms and flashing crimson lights. One moment, Elena was sipping tepid coffee, reviewing the previous day's minor anomalies. The next, her entire console erupted into a frantic, visual shriek. The data streams, once rhythmic and predictable, had flatlined into a terrifying stillness. The great conveyor belt, the planet's primary deepwater current, had simply stopped. The numbers on her screen were not just anomalous, they were impossible. Water temperatures were plummeting at a rate that defied physics, dropping several degrees in mere minutes as the engine of equatorial heat distribution ceased. The current vectors, usually strong and coherent arrows pointing southward, were now a scattered, aimless mess, indicating a complete cessation of flow. A profound, unnatural quiet descended upon the vessel, broken only by the panicked shouts of the crew on the bridge. The familiar, comforting vibration of water flowing past the hull, a sensation so constant it had become part of their very blood, faded into nothing. The Eager was suddenly adrift on a dead sea. Elena's hands trembled as she cross-referenced the data, her scientific mind racing through every conceivable error, a system-wide failure, a catastrophic sensor loss. But the corroborating evidence was overwhelming and horrifying. The ship's own external thermometers confirmed the chilling plunge. The sea around them was growing cold, a rapid, localized winter descending upon the North Atlantic, A cold dread, far deeper than the dropping temperature, seeped into Alina's bones. This was not a local event. The global conveyor was a single, interconnected system. Its halt here meant a halt everywhere. Her mind, trained to model cascading failures, painted a terrifying future in an instant. The climate regulation that supported agriculture would collapse. Rainfall patterns would vanish, leading to simultaneous droughts and deluges. The oceanic food web from the smallest plankton to the largest whale would starve. It was a blueprint for global chaos, for the end of the world as she knew it. Her scientific curiosity, that driving force that had always sought answers, now warred with a visceral human fear for her family on the coast of Spain, for every city, every forest, every future. She stumbled to the communications console, her fingers fumbling over the keys. The radio crackled to life, her voice a strained, desperate thing against the growing silence outside. Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is research vessel Aegir. We are reporting a catastrophic halt of the Atlantic Meridional overturning circulation. Repeat, the global conveyor has stopped. This is a planetary emergency. Static hissed back at her, a white noise void that seemed to swallow her words. She tried again, her message more frantic, pleading for acknowledgement from any coastal authority. Any other vessel. The responses that filtered through were fragmented, broken by the same atmospheric disturbances her models had long predicted would follow such an event. A garbled message from a freighter hundreds of miles away spoke of the same eerie calm, the same dead water. A coastal weather station transmitted a broken string of text about unprecedented barometric shifts before falling silent. Alina stood in the dimly lit comms room, the weight of the unthinkable crushing down upon her. She was the messenger of the apocalypse, and her message was dying in a storm of static, unheard by a world still blissfully unaware that its heart had just stopped beating. The vast, beautiful, life-giving ocean outside the porthole was transforming before her eyes into a stagnant, cooling tomb, and the profound silence was more terrifying than any storm. The silence that had swallowed the surface world was a mere whisper compared to the absolute stillness that had taken root in the abyss. 2. Miles below the Aegir, in a realm of perpetual midnight where the pressure could crush steel, a different kind of death was unfolding. Here, in the Hadal Zone, life had always existed on a precarious thread, sustained not by the sun but by the constant, gentle rain of nutrients from above, a snowfall of decaying matter and microscopic life carried on the great, slow-moving rivers of the deep ocean currents. That snowfall had ceased. Alina guided the remote submersible, a sleek, light-speckled beetle of titanium and glass, through waters that were unnervingly clear. There was no suspended sediment dancing in the beams, no whirl of plankton, no sense of a world in motion. The sub's lights carved tunnels through the blackness, illuminating a landscape that was both alien and profoundly familiar to her. Towering colonies of tube worms, their white stalks resembling a ghostly forest, stood motionless. Their vibrant red plumes, which once waved in the current to absorb hydrogen sulfide and other chemicals, were now closed and limp. These creatures, which could live for centuries, were built for stability, for an environment that changed over geological time, not in the span of hours. They were now starving, their symbiotic bacteria idle, their long, slow lives grinding to a halt. Further on, the light caught the faint, ghostly outline of a giant siphonophore, a stringy colonial predator that normally drifted like a living net. It hung slack in the water, its delicate bioluminescent lures extinguished. The absence of the current had collapsed its delicate structure, rendering it a formless, dying tangle. An anglerfish, a nightmare made flesh with its needle-sharp teeth and a bioluminescent lure dangling from its head, drifted into view. It was listless, its lure dark. Its hunting strategy, an exercise in infinite patience, relied on the current to bring curious prey within striking distance. In the stagnant water, there was nothing to hunt. The fish's grotesque body seemed shrunken, its huge eyes vacant with an ancient, instinctual confusion. Alina maneuvered the submersible with a heavy heart, the joystick feeling like a lead weight in her hand. Each new image transmitted to the screen on the Aegir was a testament to a hidden interconnectedness she had spent her career studying. The vibrant, sun-drenched world of the surface, with its breaching whales and diving seabirds, was utterly dependent on the health of this lightless realm. The currents were the planet's circulatory system, and the abyss was a vital organ, processing waste, sequestering carbon, and fueling the entire marine food web with its recycled nutrients. Now, that circulation had failed. The lifeblood of the ocean was no longer flowing, and the deepest, most stable ecosystems were the first to feel the chill of death. She focused the cameras on a field of sea cucumbers, normally busy vacuuming the seabed for organic detritus. They lay inert, their leathery skins pale, a slow motion. Avalanche of extinction was underway, invisible to every human eye but hers. The fragility of life in the dark depths was never more apparent. These were not creatures that could migrate or adapt quickly. They were specialists of the eternal flow, and without it, they had no defense. The sub's lights swept across the barren plain, a funeral procession for a world that had existed in perfect, dark harmony for millennia, a world whose silent death knell was echoing upwards, one starving creature at a time. The death that began in the abyssal plains did not remain contained. It spread through the deep-sea communities like a contagion, a silent, unstoppable wave of extinction. The initial starvation of the filter feeders and ambush predators created a vacuum, an absence of death that in turn doomed the scavengers. The great armies of hagfish and deep-sea crabs, the ocean's undertakers, who relied on the constant fall of carcasses from above, now found their larders empty. On the screens, aboard the Aegir, Alina watched as the seafloor, once a landscape of constant, slow-motion activity, became a graveyard without mourners. The scavengers themselves began to vanish, their populations collapsing not from direct starvation but from the eerie absence of things upon which to feast. The entire cycle of life and decay, a process as fundamental as the currents themselves, was grinding to a halt. A new and more insidious threat began to manifest in the sensor data. The oxygen levels in the deep water were plummeting. The global conveyor had not just transported heat and nutrients. It had been a vast respiratory system, pulling oxygen-rich surface waters down into the depths where it sustained entire ecosystems. With the circulation stilled, that replenishment ceased. The deep ocean began to suffocate. Anoxic zones, once rare and localized, expanded rapidly, creating vast underwater deserts where nothing could breathe. The submersible sensors painted the water in lurid shades of red and orange on Alina's monitors, indicating dangerously low dissolved oxygen. The few creatures that had survived the initial famine now faced a chemical death, their gills straining for a substance that was no longer there. Alina and her small team worked in a state of grim, helpless urgency. They documented the cascading effects with a meticulous, heartbreaking precision. Each data point was another nail in a global coffin. They recorded the mass die-offs of viperfish and lanternfish, their bioluminescent lights winking out like stars in a dying galaxy. They captured footage of entire fields of glass sponges, their intricate silica skeletons now just lifeless sculptures in a museum of the dead. The scale of the disaster was so vast, so planetary in its scope, that their efforts felt laughably insignificant. They were chroniclers of the apocalypse, armed with nothing but sensors and cameras, watching a world end in high definition, feeling a profound and crushing powerlessness. Alina compiled their most critical findings, the oxygen graphs, the biodiversity loss metrics, the chilling imagery of the silent deep. With trembling fingers, she attached the files to a burst transmission, sending an urgent, desperate plea across the shaky satellite link to every global scientific and environmental network she could access. The message was a stark, unadorned warning, a scientist's scream into the void. The foundation of the marine world was crumbling, and the collapse was accelerating. She pleaded for any kind of coordinated action, for a global response to a global catastrophe, knowing in her heart that it was likely already too late. The final, devastating plot point came from a sensor cluster monitoring a hydrothermal vent field, one of the last bastions of life independent of the sun. For decades, the key species there had been the Yeti crab, a blind, hairy crustacean that farmed bacteria on its claws in the vent's mineral-rich plumes. The vents themselves still spewed their superheated, chemical-laden water, but the delicate balance of the ecosystem had been shattered by the changing water chemistry and dropping oxygen. The sensor's high-resolution camera sent back one final, iconic image, a single, pale Yeti crab detached from its colony, drifting lifelessly in the stagnant, toxic water. Its extinction was a signal flare of irreversible damage. This was not a temporary disruption. It was a terminal diagnosis. The vents had survived every mass extinction in Earth's history, but they could not survive this. Humanity, for all its technology and ingenuity, was utterly powerless against the natural forces it had unwittingly unleashed. The deep ocean, the planet's oldest and most stable environment, was dying, and there was nothing anyone could do to save it. The ocean's silence bred a screaming chaos in the skies above. The great, placid engine of global weather, which for millennia had been driven by the steady, rhythmic exchange of heat and moisture between sea and air, seized like a neglected machine. The planet's atmospheric balance, a delicate dance choreographed by the ocean's currents, collapsed into violent, unpredictable tantrums. In Beijing, the air was thick and heavy, pressing down upon a city holding its breath. From his high-rise laboratory, Dr. Li Wei watched the data cascade across his screens, each new report more terrifying than the last. The world was breaking in half, and the fracture line was the now stagnant sea. Europe was the first to freeze. A mass of Arctic air, no longer moderated by the warm embrace of the North Atlantic drift, plunged southward like a shard of ice. London, Paris, Berlin, cities built for temperate climates, were flash-frozen under meters of snow that fell from a sky the color of lead. Rivers solidified into sculpted pathways of white. The wind that howled through deserted streets was a dry, killing cold that shattered windows and froze power grids into useless, brittle webs. It was an ice age delivered not over centuries, but in a matter of days, entombing continents in a deep freeze from which there seemed no escape. Simultaneously, the equatorial regions boiled. Without the ocean currents to siphon away the sun's relentless energy, the tropics became a pressure cooker. In the Amazon and Congo basins, the humidity became a suffocating, liquid blanket. Deadly heat waves, with temperatures soaring past any recorded history, cooked the very air. Birds fell from the sky, their small bodies overcome. The nights brought no relief, only a different kind of oppressive stillness as the land radiated the day's accumulated fury back into a star-dusted, indifferent sky. The world was a study in extremes, a planet at war with itself. Li Wei's fingers flew across his keyboard, his mind a whirlwind of correlations and projections. He overlaid the atmospheric pressure maps with the last known positions of the dying currents. The connection was undeniable, a direct line of cause and effect drawn in the language of physics and despair. The ocean's conveyor had been the planet's thermostat, and with it broken, the climate was spiraling into feedback loops of destruction. His models, once academic exercises, now spat out grimly certain forecasts. Global famines as grain belts in North America and Asia withered under drought or were buried in frost. Superstorms born from the violent clash of the new thermal extremes. Hurricanes with winds that would shred cities and storm surges that would drown them. His frustration was a physical ache, a tightness in his chest that no deep breath could ease. He compiled his data into a stark, urgent report, a plea for immediate, unprecedented global mobilization. He sent it to every ministry, every international agency, every world leader he could find an address for. The responses, when they came, were a study in bureaucratic paralysis. Some dismissed his findings as alarmist, the rantings of a scientist who had spent too long in front of a screen. Others acknowledged the crisis but were mired in debates over jurisdiction, economic impact, and political blame. A high-ranking official from a powerful nation, had the gall to suggest his data was inconvenient for ongoing trade negotiations. Li Wei stared at the politely worded email, his hands balling into fists. They were rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic, arguing over the color of the linens while the ship plunged into an abyss of their own making. The ocean's failure to regulate the climate was a lesson in planetary interdependence that humanity was failing catastrophically to learn. The sky's fury was just the beginning, and he was the lone voice screaming a warning into a gale of willful ignorance. The Caribbean sun, once a gilded blessing upon turquoise waters, now beat down with a feverish, malevolent intensity. Captain Jack Morrow stood on the bleached wood of his dock, the familiar scent of salt and diesel fuel now tinged with the sour, cloying odor of death. His boat, the Marlin Spy, sat motionless in the water, its hull a forlorn silhouette against a sea that was no longer blue but a sickly, milky white. Below the surface, a massacre was unfolding in fast forward. The great coral reefs, the vibrant, pulsing cities of the Caribbean that had sustained his family for 3 generations, were turning to bone dust before his eyes. Just days before, these waters had been a kaleidoscope of life. Jack could close his eyes and still see it. The great branching elkhorn corals like petrified amber trees, the massive brain corals etched with intricate living labyrinths, all swarming with clouds of jewel-toned fish. Parrotfish would click and crunch, their industrious grazing keeping the reefs clean, while angelfish, draped in shades of sapphire and gold, flitted through the coral canyons. The reef had been a noisy, bustling metropolis, its sounds a constant reassurance of a world in balance. It had been a giver of life, a generous, endless provider. His nets had always come up heavy with snapper and grouper, his lobster traps full. The ocean had fed his children, paid his mortgage, and filled his soul with a profound, unspoken gratitude. Now the color was draining from the world. The corals, stressed beyond endurance by the wild temperature swings born from the stalled currents, were expelling the symbiotic algae that gave them both their brilliant hues and their life. They stood like a forest of bleached skeletons, their stark white forms glowing eerily in the sun-pierced water. The process, which scientists had warned might take decades, was completing itself in a matter of days. Then the crumbling began. Without their algal partners, the corals began to starve, their delicate limestone structures turning brittle. The gentlest swell, where once it would have been absorbed by the reef's flexible strength, now sent fragments cascading down in slow-motion avalanches. The vibrant metropolis was becoming a necropolis, a field of coral graves. Jack waded into the shallows, the warm water feeling like a bath of tears. He reached down and lifted a piece of staghorn coral. It was weightless and porous in his hand, its intricate structure disintegrating into chalky powder between his fingers. There were no fish. The frantic, colorful crowds had vanished, replaced by the occasional, ghostly silhouette of a lone barracuda patrolling the barren wastes with a confused hunger. The silence was absolute, a void where the familiar clicks and pops of life had been. The ocean, the great giver, had become a taker. It had taken his livelihood, his purpose, and the only world he had ever truly known. Back on the dock, he looked at the Marlin Spy, its deck dry, its engine cold. His wife's worried face flashed in his mind, the unspoken question in their children's eyes about the next meal, the next mortgage payment. The boat was not just a vessel. It was an extension of his own body, a tool that connected him to the rhythm of the sea. Now that rhythm was gone, replaced by a stagnant, deadly calm. The dock was no longer a gateway to abundance, but a pier extending into a watery desert. His hands, calloused and strong from a lifetime of hauling lines and nets, felt useless. He was a fisherman with no fish, a captain of a dead sea, his entire existence and that of his community unraveled by the silent, distant failure of a current he had never seen, in an ocean he now feared. The Atlantic Ocean had lost its voice. It was a silence more profound than any Alina had ever known, a void where the world's most constant soundtrack had been abruptly switched off. Standing on the foredeck of the Aegir, she felt the absence like a physical blow. There was no rhythmic crash of waves against the hull, no hiss of foam on the water's surface. The sea was a vast, flat pane of obsidian, perfectly still, reflecting the bruised purple and orange of a dying sunset with a mirror's cold precision. The only sound was the low, mournful whine of the wind as it skimmed the water, finding no purchase, no resistance, a lonely ghost wandering over a liquid graveyard. Her gaze swept the empty horizon, a perfect, unbroken circle of nothing. Where there should have been the distant, hopeful smudges of container ships, the playful arcs of dolphin fins, or the misty spouts of whales, there was only a chilling vacancy. The marine traffic had vanished, either port-bound in a global panic or adrift in the same unnerving calm. The seabirds were gone, their raucous cries silenced, their absence from the rigging a stark testament to the collapse of the food web that had once stretched from the abyss to the sky. The Atlantic, the great highway of exploration, the bustling corridor of commerce and life, had become a desert of water. Its pulse, its breath, its very soul had been extinguished. Alina's mind drifted back through centuries to the history written upon these silent waters. She pictured the Norse longships, their dragon-headed prows cutting through swells driven by these very currents, carrying explorers to unknown worlds. She thought of Columbus, his fragile caravels pushed westward by the North Atlantic drift, a current that was now a memory. This ocean had been the stage for the age of discovery, its currents the invisible guides that shaped empires and forged continents. The Gulf Stream had warmed Europe's shores, making civilizations possible where otherwise there would have been only ice. The transatlantic slave trade, for all its horror, had been a grim journey on these waters, its roots dictated by the same circulatory system that was now defunct. Every major event in the modern human story was, in some way, a ripple from this ocean's steady, powerful flow. Now that flow was stilled. The ocean's voice, which had whispered secrets to sailors and roared challenges to adventurers, was silent. It was a silence that erased history, that nullified the very forces of wind and water that had carried humanity across the globe. The great conveyor belt had not just regulated climate, it had been a central character in the human narrative, a force of nature that enabled, challenged, and connected. Its silencing felt like the end of a story, the final page turned on an era defined by the sea's boundless energy. The wind picked up, a cold, dry gust that carried no scent of salt or life. It was a land wind, an alien thing on the open ocean. Alina shivered, pulling her jacket tighter. The silence was not peaceful, it was accusatory. It was the silence of a machine that had run perfectly for millennia, only to be broken by the careless hands of its operators. She was adrift on a monument to human folly, a sea that had given everything, sustenance, climate, a path to new worlds, and had received in return a neglect so profound it had simply stopped. The Atlantic was silent, and in that silence, Alina heard the echo of a world that had forgotten how to listen. The ocean did not rage, it simply arrived. In Miami, the sea's advance was not a dramatic, crashing assault, but a quiet, insidious invasion. There was no storm, no hurricane's fury, only the unnerving, placid rise of water that ignored the old rules of tides and moons. It spilled over seawalls not with a roar, but with a sigh, a relentless, silent creep that turned streets into rivers and parking lots into lagoons. The crisis began not with a bang, but with a gradual, chilling soak, as if the continent itself were sinking. Maria first noticed it on her morning run along the bayfront, the familiar path now glistening with an inch of salt water that hadn't receded with the dawn. The air, usually thick with humidity and the scent of blooming jasmine, now carried the brackish, metallic tang of the flooded city. The water was unnervingly warm, a stagnant bath that lapped at the foundations of multi-million-dollar condos and low-income housing projects with the same indifferent ease. It was a democratic disaster, a slow-motion drowning that respected no zip code. The ocean, no longer held in check by the great, stabilizing currents, was sloshing unevenly across the globe, and Miami was one of the first places it decided to reclaim. By midday, the quiet crisis had erupted into chaos. The power flickered and died as saltwater breached subterranean electrical substations. plunging entire neighborhoods into a pre-modern silence broken only by the sound of rising water and rising panic. Abandoned cars, their engines flooded, became metal islands in the newly formed canals. Maria, a lifelong resident who knew her neighborhood's every alley and shortcut, became an impromptu guide for the disoriented and the elderly. She waded through knee-deep water, her sneakers soaked and heavy, helping Mrs. Gable from 3B carry her medication and her yapping terrier to higher ground. The fear in the old woman's eyes was a reflection of the community's collective dread, a primal understanding that the very ground beneath their feet was no longer trustworthy. The thin veneer of civilization began to crack under the water's pressure. From her second-story window, Maria watched a group of figures, their faces obscured by hoodies, use a crowbar to pry open the grill over a bodega's door. They moved with a frantic, desperate energy, emerging with armfuls of bottled water and non-perishable food. Looters. The word felt archaic, something from history books, but the reality was playing out in the murky street below. The police were nowhere to be seen. The emergency services, overwhelmed by the scale of the flooding, were just a distant, static-filled promise on battery-powered radios. Society's safety nets had dissolved in the saltwater, leaving behind a raw struggle for survival. The fear was no longer just of the water, but of each other, a chilling breakdown of the social contract. Then the real inundation began, a subterranean wall compromised by the saturated earth gave way several blocks inland. A surge of water, more powerful than any before it, rushed through the streets with the force of a burst dam. It slammed into the foundations of Maria's apartment building, a 6-story structure that had withstood decades of hurricanes. The sound was a deep, groaning shudder that vibrated through the very bones of the building. Plaster dust snowed from the ceiling. The lights, running on a failing generator, flickered wildly and then died for good. From the stairwell came the terrifying sound of rushing water, a churning, gurgling torrent climbing the steps. Her home, her sanctuary filled with photographs and books and the accumulated memories of a life, was being consumed from below. The ocean was not just at the door. It was in the basement, in the elevator shaft, rising up the stairs with a cold, patient hunger. Her vulnerability to nature's whims was now absolute, a personal and devastating reality. The building, a symbol of human permanence, was becoming her tomb, and the streets, choked with dark, swirling water and the shadows of desperate people, were her only escape. From the ruins of a drowned city, a new kind of community began to emerge, forged not by shared history or ideology, but by shared survival. The makeshift camp sprawled across the high ground of a city park, a ragged tapestry of tarps strung between skeletal trees and tents salvaged from flooded sporting goods stores. The air, thick with the smell of damp earth, wood smoke, and simmering broth, was a stark contrast to the sterile, chlorinated scent of the lost world below. Here, amid the mud and the murmured anxieties, the ocean's role as a destroyer was being challenged by its unexpected power as a unifier. The same catastrophe that had shattered their individual lives was forcing them to build something new, something collective, from the wreckage. Maria, her own apartment now part of the silent, submerged cityscape, found purpose in the organized chaos. Using skills honed from years of managing a busy office, she commandeered a cluster of picnic tables near the camp center, transforming them into a food distribution point. Pallets of military-issue MREs and canned goods, airdropped by helicopters that appeared like fleeting, mechanical angels, were stacked in neat rows. She organized a system, a line that moved with a weary but respectful order. Her voice, once used for conference calls and client meetings, was now calm and firm, directing volunteers and reassuring the frightened. She saw the faces of her neighbors not as strangers, but as fellow refugees from the same sunken ship. A man who had been a corporate lawyer now carefully counted out portions of rice. A woman who had taught yoga helped lift heavy crates, her movements strong and sure. In the face of overwhelming adversity, a raw, resilient humanity was flourishing. As dusk settled, painting the sky in shades of violet and charcoal, the campfires flickered to life. around. These small, defiant flames, stories were shared in low, solemn tones. An elderly fisherman spoke of the unnatural stillness of the sea, the absence of gulls that had haunted him more than the flooding. A young mother rocked her child, whispering about the terrifying silence that had followed the power's failure, a silence more profound than any noise. They were stories of loss, of homes, of loved ones, of a future they had taken for granted. But in the telling, in the simple act of being heard, the burden became a little lighter. The ocean had taken their city, but in this camp, it had given them a common enemy and, paradoxically, a common bond. It was a duality as old as the sea itself, the power to obliterate and the power to bring together. While Maria tended to the physical needs of the camp, a different kind of crisis management was unfolding hundreds of miles away, aboard the Aegir. In the ship's dimly lit communications room, lit only by the glow of monitors, Alina scrolled through a cascade of incoming reports. The satellite link, fragile and intermittent, delivered a global litany of despair. A bulletin from the Bay of Bengal described mass migrations from drowned deltas. A fragment from West Africa spoke of coastal fisheries collapsing, triggering famine inland. A clipped, official report from the Netherlands confirmed that their famed dikes and barriers were failing against the stagnant, rising sea. Each message was a piece of the same horrifying puzzle. The coastal crisis was not Miami's alone. It was a universal symptom of a planet in physiological shock. The ocean silence in the Atlantic was screaming in 1,000 different languages across every shoreline on Earth. The community strength Maria was fostering on a local scale was a microcosm of what would be needed on a global one, a truth that settled in Alina's gut with the heavy certainty of a stone sinking into the abyss. The ocean's silence had a voice, and it was screaming through trees. Far from any coast, deep in the heart of the Amazon, the great green lungs of the planet were beginning to suffocate. The humid air, once thick with the scent of wet earth, blooming orchids and decaying leaves, grew thin and parched. The constant, life-giving drizzle that had sustained the rainforest for millennia, a precipitation cycle driven by the steady evaporation from the Atlantic, faltered and then failed. The forest floor, usually a soft, spongy mattress of compost, cracked underfoot, its fissures like open mouths gasping for a drink that would not come. The whispers were no longer those of hidden life, but the dry rustle of dying leaves and the ominous creak of stressed timber. From his austere office in Beijing, a world away from the verdant chaos of the tropics, Dr. Li Wei watched the murder unfold in cold, digital precision. His screens were no longer filled with atmospheric pressure maps, but with satellite imagery of South America, Africa, and Southeast Asia. The vibrant green canopies, seen from space, were being marbled with sickly shades of brown and yellow. The data streams told a stark story of plummeting soil moisture, rising canopy temperatures, and a catastrophic drop in photosynthetic activity. He overlaid these new datasets with his models of the defunct ocean currents, and the correlation was as brutal as it was simple. The rainforests of the world were not independent entities. They were the children of the sea. The moisture that fed them was born from ocean evaporation, carried inland by atmospheric rivers whose very existence depended on the temperature gradients the currents had maintained. With the ocean's engine dead, the rains had stopped. The whispers turned to a roar. The first plumes of smoke appeared on the thermal sensors, tiny orange pinpricks of despair igniting in the tinder-dry undergrowth. Without the humidity that had once made them nearly fireproof, the forests became kindling. The fires spread not as raging walls of flame, but as a slow, smoldering cancer, consuming centuries of growth in days. From space, Li Wei watched the Amazon become a constellation of wildfires, their smoke plumes merging into a vast gray shroud that blotted out the sun below. The same story repeated in the Congo Basin and the islands of Indonesia, a planetary-scale cremation of biodiversity. The ocean's failure was writing its obituary on the land in ash and embers. With a grim, methodical fury, Li Wei compiled his evidence. He created animations that showed, in undeniable visual terms, the direct link between the flatlined Atlantic currents and the spreading brown stain of drought and fire in the Amazon. He calculated the carbon release, a number so large it felt abstract, yet represented a fatal blow to any hope of climate recovery. He modeled the cascading ecosystem collapses, the loss of pollinators, the extinction of canopy species, the desertification of the world's most fertile biomes. His final report was not a warning, it was a eulogy. He published it to every scientific and governmental portal he could access, a grim forecast of total terrestrial breakdown. The land-ocean connection was not a poetic metaphor. It was a biological fact, a literal lifeline. The forests were whispering their final secrets, and they were all about the sea. The marine systems, now stagnant and dying, had been the true pillars holding the terrestrial world aloft, and with their collapse, the entire edifice of life on land was beginning to crumble. The world's breadbaskets became its graveyards. The erratic, violent weather born from the ocean's silence did not just alter the climate, it systematically dismantled the very concept of global agriculture. In the American Midwest, where endless fields of corn and wheat had once rippled like a golden sea, the soil was now either iron-hard from unprecedented drought or frozen solid under a cap of ice that refused to thaw. Tractor tires spun uselessly in the permafrost, and seeds lay dormant in the cold, dead earth, their genetic programming useless against a new, hostile reality. In the rice paddies of Southeast Asia, the opposite horror unfolded. Monsoon seasons vanished, replaced by erratic, torrential downpours that fell not as life-giving rain, but as drowning floods that washed away topsoil and submerged entire harvests under meters of muddy water. The global food chain, a fragile, just-in-time miracle of modern logistics, snapped. The economic collapse was not a slow recession but a seismic, instantaneous shattering. Stock markets, which had nervously twitched for weeks, flatlined into digital tombstones. The value of currency evaporated overnight, replaced by the brutal, simple arithmetic of barter. A can of beans became worth more than a portfolio of stocks. A gallon of clean water was a king's ransom. Supermarket shelves, those temples of consumer abundance, were stripped bare in hours, their emptiness a stark visual representation of the end of an era. Supply chains that had stretched across oceans lay broken, their container ships stranded in the dead ports of a dead sea. The complex, interconnected web of human commerce, built on the assumption of a stable planet, dissolved into a frantic, localized scramble for survival. As the farms failed and the economies crumbled, the migrations began. They were not the orderly, political migrations of history, but a desperate, viral surge of humanity fleeing the epicenters of ecological disaster. Vast caravans of people, carrying their lives in backpacks and shopping carts, clogged the highways out of the sun-scorched south and the ice-locked north. They moved not toward promise, but away from certain death, a tidal wave of refugees with hollow eyes and blistered feet. Makeshift camps swelled into instant, teeming cities on the borders of any region that still had access to fresh water and arable land. Their populations a chaotic mosaic of languages and cultures united by single shared instinct to survive. In the radio shack of the Aegir, the world's agony was distilled into flickering lines of text on a screen. Alina, her face gaunt with exhaustion, huddled over the terminal, its weak satellite connection her only tether to the collapsing mainland. Through the static, a message from Li Wei in Beijing materialized, a string of data and grim observations. Their collaboration was a ghostly partnership, two scientists passing notes across the ruin of the world they had tried to warn. He sent her atmospheric models showing the complete decoupling of ocean and climate. She sent him the deep-sea oxygen readings that confirmed the permanence of the catastrophe. Their shared data painted the full, horrifying scope of the domino effect. The stilled ocean had broken the weather, which had killed the farms, which had bankrupted the nations, which had unleashed the human tide. It was a textbook cascade failure, playing out in real time on a planetary scale. The final, futile gasp of global order was a live-streamed United Nations emergency session, a broadcast that flickered onto Alina's screen from a bunker in Geneva. The faces of world leaders were pale and drawn on the grainy feed, their voices translated into a sterile, overlapping chorus of panic and blame. They debated resource allocation and humanitarian corridors, their words echoing in a chamber that felt utterly disconnected from the anarchy unfolding outside. Proposals were made and immediately vetoed. Accusations flew like shrapnel. The meeting, meant to be a beacon of coordinated response, devolved into a cacophony of national self-interest, a perfect mirror of the fragmented world. After hours of circular, fruitless argument, the session was adjourned, ending not with a resolution but in a bitter, hopeless deadlock. The plot point was not an action but an admission of defeat. The domino effect of ecological disaster had proven too fast, too vast, for human institutions to comprehend, let alone contain. The chain reaction was complete, and civilization was its final, spectacular casualty. The road to the refugee camp was a river of dust and despair, a slow-moving current of humanity flowing away from the broken coasts and the blighted farms. Jack Morrow walked it alone, the weight of his small, salvaged pack nothing compared to the hollow ache in his chest. The vibrant Caribbean world of his memory, the turquoise water, the cry of gulls, the sturdy feel of his boat's wheel, had been replaced by this monochrome landscape of dust and weary faces. He had lost his home, his boat, his purpose. All that remained was the simple, animal need to put one foot in front of the other, to find a place where the ground was not dying beneath his feet. The camp sprawled across a barren plateau, a makeshift city of tents and lean-tos that hummed with the low, constant murmur of thousands of voices. It was a tapestry of survival, woven from threads of every color and creed. A woman in a sari, its vibrant silk now faded and dusty, patiently stirred a communal pot over a small fire. A group of men who had once worn business suits under skyscrapers now worked together to raise the frame of a new shelter, their movements clumsy but determined. There were families from frozen Scandinavian cities and others from sun-scorched Saharan villages. Their diverse histories collapsed into a single, shared present. They were united not by language or custom, but by the raw, unvarnished fact of survival, a commonality forged in the crucible of a shared catastrophe. Driven by a lifetime of habit, Jack found his way to the camp's edge, where a sluggish, muddy river curled through the cracked earth. A small group was there, attempting to fish with handmade lines and nets woven from scavenged plastic. The sight of water, any water, called to the fisherman in him. He joined them without a word, his experienced eyes quickly assessing the poor odds. This was not the clear, nutrient-rich sea he knew. This was a stagnant, inland trickle. Yet he showed them how to read the slight disturbances on the surface, where the water pooled a little deeper, and how to patiently wait for the infrequent, listless tug on a line. It was a pale imitation of his old life, a ghost of his craft, but in the act of teaching, of contributing, he felt a flicker of the old purpose. He was adapting, bending to a new, harsher reality, trading the open ocean for a muddy creek, the bounty of the sea for the meager hope of a few small, bony fish. As night fell, the cold air of the high plateau was held at bay by the warmth of a large, central campfire. People gathered around it, drawn like moths to the one source of both heat and light in the encroaching darkness. Jack sat among them, a silent observer at first, watching the flames dance across the faces of his fellow exiles. Then an elderly man from a drowned Pacific island began to speak in a soft, melodic tone, describing the way. The waves had once sung his people to sleep. A woman from the American Midwest, her hands calloused from a life of farming, spoke of the smell of rich, dark soil after a spring rain, a scent she feared she would never experience again. One by one, they offered their stories, small, precious artifacts from a lost world. Jack found himself speaking, his voice rough with disuse. He did not talk of the global currents or the scientific collapse. He spoke of the Caribbean sun on his shoulders, the specific muscular tug of a mahi-mahi on his line, and the brilliant, living rainbow of the coral reef that had been his backyard. As he shared these fragments of his past, he saw them reflected in the eyes of the listeners, not as a source of fresh pain, but as a shared memorial. The solace was not in the remembering, but in the being heard, in the silent understanding that passed between them. They were all mourners at the same funeral, honoring the loss of 1,000 different traditional ways of life, their individual griefs merging into a collective lament around the fire. In that moment, the fire became more than warmth. It was an altar to human adaptability, a testament to the stubborn will to find connection and meaning, even as their old world crumbled to dust and ash around them. The burden of knowledge was a physical weight, a lodestone of guilt settled deep in Alina's chest that made every breath an effort. In the stark solitude of her cabin aboard the Aegir, surrounded by the hum of dormant servers and the ghostly glow of empty monitors, she was a prisoner of her own foresight. The global collapse, the screaming chaos on the news feeds before they too had fallen silent, the human exodus. It was all a horrifying data set that confirmed her oldest, most dreadful predictions. Years of published papers, of urgent presentations at conferences where polite applause had masked institutional indifference, now echoed in her mind not as academic achievements, but as a series of failed warnings. She had seen the trajectory, had charted the path to the precipice with mathematical certainty, and yet her voice had been just one among many in the scientific chorus, too easily dismissed by the roaring engine of business as usual. The ethical responsibility of the scientist was to warn, but what was the responsibility when the warnings went unheeded? The answer, it seemed, was to carry the crushing guilt of the preventable. She isolated herself from the hushed conversations of the remaining crew, retreating into a self-imposed exile of code and equations. Her new mission, a desperate, almost ludicrous attempt at atonement, was to build a simulation for ocean restoration. The project was a digital ghost ship, a fantastical model of a world that could be put right. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, inputting variables for massive, global-scale interventions. Fleets of ships churning the water to simulate currents, networks of pipes pumping oxygen into the anoxic depths, orbital mirrors to manipulate surface temperatures. She modeled the seeding of genetically engineered algae, the triggering of artificial upwellings, every geoengineering gambit she had ever debated in theoretical journals. The lines of code scrolled, a river of potential flowing across her screen, building a beautiful, intricate castle of pure logic in the air. But the castle was built on sand. With every completed model run, the cold, hard truth of the data would reassert itself. The simulation's results were a study in devastating feasibility. Even with a global mobilization of resources that no longer existed, the energy required to jumpstart the planetary circulatory system was orders of magnitude beyond human capability. The timescales for any meaningful recovery were geological, stretching not into decades or centuries, but into millennia. The ocean's inertia, its sheer, staggering mass, was an opponent against which all human technology was a pebble thrown into. A stagnant sea, her beautiful simulation was a lie, a digital pacifier for her own conscience, and she knew it. The doubt was a corrosive acid, eating away at the foundations of her hope. She was a doctor trying to perform heart surgery on a planet-sized corpse with a child's plastic toy. The thematic conflict of her life was now laid bare in the dim light of the cabin. The burden of knowledge was not just about knowing what was coming, it was about the powerlessness that followed. The ethical responsibility to act crashed against the immovable wall of physical impossibility. She had dedicated her life to understanding the ocean systems, and that very understanding now told her they were broken beyond any human capacity to repair. The weight was unbearable. She was Sisyphus with a supercomputer, pushing a boulder of data up a mountain of despair, only to watch it roll back down every time, crushing her a little more with each futile cycle. The dilemma was absolute: to continue the charade of a solution for the sake of her own sanity, or to surrender to the grim certainty of the data and accept that her role was no longer that of a savior, but that of a chronicler of the end. The silence of the dead ocean outside her porthole was the only answer she received. The world did not end, but it became something else entirely, something leaner, harder, and quieter. The frantic chaos of the collapse had given way to a grim, global settling, a slow and painful adaptation to a new climate normal. The planet had found a different, more brutal equilibrium, one defined not by the ocean's rhythmic pulse, but by the stark realities of a broken system. Regions once locked in ice saw their permafrost recede, revealing thin, rocky soil that hardy, genetically modified crops could sometimes coax a yield from. Conversely, former breadbaskets in temperate zones remained barren, their climate too erratic, their soil too depleted to support anything but the most determined weeds. The map of habitability had been redrawn in the harsh ink of necessity, creating a patchwork of precarious havens amidst vast swathes of wasteland. Human societies, stripped of the global interconnectedness that had both sustained and endangered them, turned inward. The age of the supply chain was over, replaced by the age of the local collective. Towns and neighborhoods became self-contained universes, their survival dependent on their ability to harness the resources immediately at hand. Rooftops and every spare patch of earth bristled with solar panels, their surfaces drinking in the sun's erratic but vital energy. Small-scale wind turbines spun on hillsides, their rhythmic whir a new sound of civilization. The knowledge of how to repair, reuse, and repurpose became more valuable than any currency, traded in community workshops and barter markets. It was a world learning to live within its shrunken means, a forced march toward localized sustainability born from the ashes of global excess. In her isolated lab, now powered by a bank of humming solar batteries, Alina ran the final iteration of her long-term simulation. The model, which had once been a playground for fantastical geoengineering schemes, was now a sober tool for forecasting the planet's slow, autonomic recovery. The results were not hopeful, but they were not entirely without a flicker of light. The data suggested that, over several centuries, a partial, weakened version of the thermohaline circulation might spontaneously resume. It would not be the great, life-giving conveyor of old, but a sluggish, localized exchange, enough to perhaps moderate the most extreme temperature differences and allow for a slow, gradual replenishment of deep ocean oxygen. It was a prognosis of convalescence measured not in human lifetimes, but in the lifespan of civilizations. The recovery of the natural world would be a story written in epics, a painfully slow pace that mocked humanity's frantic timescales. A concrete example of this new resilience emerged from an unexpected corner of the world. In a deep fjord in Norway, shielded from the worst of the global weather extremes, a community had refused to surrender to the barren cold. They had turned away from the Dead Sea and looked instead to the living rock beneath their feet. Tapping into the seething geothermal heart of the Earth, they channeled volcanic heat through a network of pipes snaking under vast, enclosed biomes. Within these steamy, glass-walled sanctuaries, a miracle of adaptation flourished. Potatoes, carrots, and hardy grains grew in soil warmed by the planet's own core, their leaves glistening with condensation under artificial lights powered by the same geothermal turbines. It was a plot point not of grand salvation, but of stubborn, ingenious persistence. The community's success was a quiet anthem to human resilience, a demonstration that life could find a way, not by conquering nature, but by learning to work within its new, unforgiving rules. The slow pace of natural recovery was being met, in small, isolated pockets, by the fierce, determined pace of human survival. Life, in its tenacious and stubborn way, persisted. It did not reclaim the world in its former, glorious abundance, but learned to thrive in the narrow, harsh margins left by the cataclysm. In the high-altitude basin that had become his home, Jack Morrow found a new rhythm, one dictated not by the tides but by the careful, measured flow of water through man-made channels. The inland aquaculture farm was a sprawling complex of ponds and raceways, a geometric patchwork of contained life etched into the dry earth. Here, in water pumped from deep, cold aquifers and filtered through banks of algae and reeds, a new ecosystem was being nurtured. They cultivated hardy, fast-growing species of tilapia and carp, fish that could tolerate the lower oxygen levels and higher temperatures of this new world. It was a far cry from the wild, open ocean hunt. But as Jack waded into the shallow pond, his hands gently checking the nets for breeding stock, he felt a flicker of the old connection. He was no longer a taker from the sea, but a caretaker, a steward of a fragile, human-made reef in the desert. The purpose was different, quieter, but it was real. He was helping to build a new food web from the ground up, a testament to life's enduring, adaptable cycle. While Jack tended to his contained waters, Alina was finally releasing her knowledge into the world. After years of isolation and simulation, she compiled her life's work, her initial warnings, the catastrophic data from the Aegir, and her long-term forecasts into a single, monumental document. She did not publish it in a prestigious journal for peer review. Those institutions were ghosts of a bygone age. Instead, she broadcast it across the remaining global networks, a digital seed scattered to the wind. Her findings were a stark, unflinching autopsy of the old world and a sober map of the new one. She detailed which coastal areas might see stabilization in a century, which deep-water currents showed the faintest signs of sluggish movement, and which remaining terrestrial ecosystems were most critical to protect. But the core of her message was not scientific, it was a plea. She advocated for a new kind of global cooperation, not of trade and diplomacy, but of shared stewardship. She urged the scattered, struggling communities to protect the remaining functioning systems, the last intact forests, the clean freshwater aquifers, the stable geothermal zones. It was a call to build a civilization that worked with the planet's new equilibrium, rather than fighting a futile war to restore the old one. This was the theme that now defined existence, hope amid ruin. The world was a graveyard of lost possibilities, its scars visible from orbit. Yet in the cracks of that ruin, green shoots insisted on emerging. Jack's fish farms were one such shoot. The community gardens Maria tended in her rebuilt settlement were another. The geothermal greenhouses in Norway were a third. They were small, isolated points of light in a long, dark night, but they were not extinguished. The enduring cycle of life had not been broken, only bent into a new, more difficult shape. It was a cycle that now demanded more from humanity, more humility, more care, more patience. The hope was not for a return to what was, but for a future where the mistakes of the past were not repeated, where the fragile, beautiful interconnectedness of all things was respected not as an abstract concept, but as the first and most vital law of survival. The ruin was profound, but the persistence of life, in its altered and resilient forms, was a quiet, powerful rebellion against total despair. The sand was cool and damp beneath her feet, a pale, gritty silk that whispered of ages past. Alina walked slowly along the water's edge, the hem of her trousers darkening where the languid, almost imperceptible waves licked the shore. This was not the ocean of her memory, not the roaring, breathing entity that had once powered the world. This sea was different, subdued, placid, its surface a sheet of hammered silver under a soft, gray sky. It was a quiet beach on a quiet coast, a place where the world seemed to be holding its breath, reflecting on all that had been lost and all that, against impossible odds, remained. Years had passed since the collapse, years of grim adaptation and slow, painful learning. The frantic terror had faded into a kind of weary acceptance, a global sigh. Here, on this forgotten stretch of shoreline, Alina felt the weight of those years settle upon her like a familiar cloak. She stopped, her hands buried in the pockets of her worn jacket, and watched the flat, still water. There were no crashing waves, only a gentle, sighing swell that barely disturbed the sand. The silence was profound, a vast open cathedral of memory. In this quiet, the events of the past played out in her mind not as a chaotic nightmare, but as a stark, linear lesson. The frantic alarms on the Aegir, the chilling stillness of the deep, the screaming skies, the flooded cities, they were all chapters in a single, devastating story about the delicate, intricate balances that held the world together. She had been a scientist who understood those balances in theory. She had become a survivor who understood them in her bones. Her reflection was not merely internal, it was being committed to paper. In a small, solar-powered cabin nestled in the dunes behind her, a manuscript was growing. It was not a dry, scientific treatise, though it was grounded in a lifetime of data. It was a memoir, a chronicle of the ocean's last days as a living force. She wrote of its former glory, its rhythmic, life-giving pulse, and the terrible, silent moment of its failure. She wrote of the deep-sea creatures starving in the dark, the coral reefs turning to dust, and the human cost measured in drowned homes and broken lives. But she also wrote of the lessons. She emphasized the interconnectedness of it all, how a current failing in the North Atlantic could freeze Europe and boil the Amazon, how the death of a single species in the abyss could unravel a food web that stretched to the sky. Her words were a plea to the future, a warning carved from the wreckage of the past, insisting that Earth's systems were not a backdrop for human ambition, but the very stage upon which all life performed. 100 miles inland, in the heart of a community built from salvaged materials and shared purpose, another kind of reflection was taking root. Maria knelt in the rich, dark soil of a community garden, her fingers carefully weeding around the sturdy stems of kale and potatoes. The garden was a vibrant, living quilt of green, a defiant splash of color against the dusty, muted landscape. It was more than a source of food. It was a symbol, a daily act of faith and regrowth. Each seed planted, each seedling nurtured, was a quiet rebellion against the barrenness that had consumed so much of the world. As she worked, Maria thought of the flooded streets of Miami, the panic, the desperate struggle for survival. That memory was a sharp, painful stone in her pocket, but the garden was the soft earth that slowly wore it smooth. Tending to this small, thriving ecosystem was her way of reflecting on the past, not by dwelling in the loss, but by actively participating in the creation of something new, something resilient and deeply rooted. The legacy of the ocean story was no longer just a tale of catastrophe. It was a foundational text for a new generation. Children who had never heard the crash of a real wave or seen the leap of a dolphin were learning about it from Alina's writings and from the stories told by elders like Maria. They learned of the great, silent engine that had once been, and they learned the price of its neglect. This legacy was not one of despair, but of profound, hard-won respect. It was a story that taught the value of balance, the necessity of humility, and the fragile, beautiful web that connects a drop of rain to a deep ocean current, a community garden to the memory of a sea. The ocean itself was a ghost of its former self, but its story, reflected upon by a scientist on a quiet beach and enacted by a gardener in the soil, had become a compass for the future, pointing toward a world that would never again make the mistake of taking its heart for granted. The ocean remained a monument to its own transformation, a vast, silent testament to the cataclysm that had redefined the planet. It no longer roared with the fury of storms or whispered with the gentle push and pull of tides. It existed in a state of profound stillness, a liquid plain that mirrored the sky with an almost perfect, unsettling fidelity. Yet, for those who knew how to look, faint signs of a slow, geological recovery were etched into its new reality. Along certain coastlines, a thin, hesitant scum of phytoplankton occasionally tinted the water a pale, milky green, the first tentative stirrings of a base food web rebuilding itself from sunlight and remnant nutrients. In the deepest trenches, sensors left behind from a more technologically arrogant age recorded the faintest of temperature gradients, a suggestion that the most primordial, convective movements of the Earth's heart were beginning to stir the abyssal waters once more. It was not a return, but a recalibration, a patient, eons-long journey toward a new kind of balance. On a morning washed clean by a recent rain, the sun began its ascent over this changed sea. The horizon, a sharp, unbroken line, first glowed with a soft, peach-colored light that bled into the bottomless indigo of the sky. Then, the first sliver of the sun itself appeared, a blinding sliver of gold that set the perfectly flat surface of the ocean ablaze. It did not sparkle or dance. It burned with a single, concentrated fire, a path of liquid light stretching from the horizon to the shore without a single ripple to distort its perfection. The clouds, thin and streaked high above, caught the fire and blushed a deep, impossible rose. The air was so clear and the sea so still that the entire scene had a quality of hyperreality, a painting of such sublime beauty that it stole the breath and hushed the mind. This sunrise was not a daily occurrence. It was an event, a silent, awe-inspiring performance that served as a powerful reminder of nature's ultimate power and its exquisite fragility. It was a beauty that did not promise safety or abundance, but simply was, a force that would persist in grandeur long after the struggles of any single species had faded from memory. The narrative of the ocean's silencing and the world's subsequent unraveling was not just a story of loss. It was the most profound lesson in interconnectedness humanity would ever receive. The call that echoed from this new silence was not one of despair, but one for a deep and abiding respect. It was a demand to see the Earth not as a collection of separate resources to be exploited, but as a single, breathing organism where the atmosphere, the hydrosphere, the geosphere, and the biosphere were inextricably linked. The failure of one current in one ocean had triggered a cascade that froze continents, boiled rainforests, and starved nations, proving that the boundaries humans drew on maps were meaningless to the systems that truly governed life. The path forward, for whatever civilization might rise from the ashes, depended on this understanding. It required a commitment to protect not just the remaining wild places, but the delicate, invisible relationships between them, to safeguard the wind patterns, the water cycles, and the chemical balances that were the true infrastructure of the world. As the sun lifted fully above the horizon, bathing the still sea in its full, brilliant light, a sense of profound wonder settled over the lone observer on the shore. It was a wonder tinged with sorrow for what was gone, but vastly greater was the wonder for what remained, and for the sheer, majestic fact of existence itself. The ocean, in its new, quiet state, was no less magnificent. It was a different kind of temple, one that preached a sermon of humility and consequence. The story closed not with an ending, but with this enduring sense of awe, a quiet, powerful feeling that would guide the hands that planted the next seed, the minds that designed the next engine, and the hearts that remembered the price of ignorance. The wonder was for the resilience of life, and the respect was for the intricate, beautiful, and utterly non-negotiable systems of the earth, which demanded, above all else, to be heard.